Hi, everyone. I'm David Williams, president of strategy consulting firm Health Business Group and host of the HealthBiz podcast, a weekly show where I interview top healthcare entrepreneurs about their lives and careers. If you like this episode, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. My guest today is Amy Brown, founder and CEO of Authenticx. Amy, welcome to the HealthBiz podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here, David.
So you have a great story, so I want to hear it, and I want everyone to hear it. So just interested, first of all, in your background and upbringing. What was your childhood like, and any childhood experiences that have influenced your career path?
Yes, so I grew up the only daughter, but middle child to two brothers. My father was and still is a pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon. My mom is a special ed teacher. And that played a role in what I do today because my parents were always working with populations of people and oftentimes patients that had to interface with systems, either the educational system or the healthcare system. And I knew as I was growing up that I didn't exactly want to fall in the footsteps of being a clinician, but I did see and start to develop a passion around how the system of healthcare was impacting large populations of people. And so I got my education and went to graduate school in social work, actually. Most social workers take a career in a very interpersonal environment where they're working with individuals and families. And I continue to stay passionate at the system level. And so my first real opportunities out of graduate school were in state government, where I started to learn about large populations of folks, like people in the child welfare system, people who needed support through Medicaid. And I started to really understand their stories. And I started to get really an idea for how listening to stories can actually help. If you aggregate them and pick out the macro themes, it can actually help businesses, government, industry understand those populations they serve better. So that's a little bit about.
See, that's pretty good. So I have to be careful what kind of question I ask, So you were in between two brothers. Now, did they have such a profound reaction to their childhood as well, or were they more sort of more traditional in that sense of just sort of going forward without so much reference to everything going on around them?
Yeah, my oldest brother took a role in life sciences, but in the business side of life sciences. And my younger brother became a physical therapist. So we all kind of took our own version of what we learned from watching my mom and dad.
Yeah. And were your parents pleased with you?
Oh, I think so. I think so. We're all off the payroll. So.
Yeah. No, that sounds pretty good. Now, so it's interesting because you did a somewhat, I don't call it non-traditional path, but a lot of the CEOs that I speak with had more of a business focus from what they were doing. And as you mentioned, your bachelor's and master's are not really sort of business oriented, and neither was your first kind of a role. But as you reflect on your education in particular, have those degrees or what you learned in school been useful in the business world?
In crazy ways they've been useful. So you would not think of a social work degree being, something that was applicable in business. But the reality is in business, there are human beings. And particularly in the C-suite of businesses, there's a lot of opportunity to witness and observe dysfunction and to help, influence that dysfunction. And so definitely, really the majority of my career has been spent in business, and I have used that social work degree every day to really understand the humans with whom I'm trying to influence and collaborate, and it's been tremendously helpful degree.
Great. So before we get into the private sector roles, you mentioned you had some roles with the state to begin with. So first of all, which state and what kind of roles?
state of Indiana, and my roles were in the Family and Social Services Administration. So that's the part of the executive branch of government in Indiana that deals with social systems, healthcare, policy, things around Medicaid, child welfare, etc. My role, I loved it. It was actually to be the legislative director, which meant I was representing the executive branch's perspective or position on issues to the legislative branch. So I would go over to the state house and I would represent the governor's position on particular pieces of legislation.
I actually, as I mentioned, there's a lot of people that I interview that have a business background, but there are some that have been worked in the policy side of things. And one of the things that I had noted, and also I grew up in Washington, D.C., so I saw this as well, is that working for either state or federal government can be an interesting way in an early career to have very senior exposure and impact. And I saw it's not just you working for the governor's office, but I think you had a role directly with the governor and being able to represent his position. It's kind of a big deal.
Yes, it felt like a very big deal. I still look back on those days, 20 years ago and feel so fortunate. And you're exactly right. I think for young professionals, working in a government position gives you an opportunity to lead probably earlier than you would if you had started, in the private sector immediately. And so you're right. I got access to senior level policymakers, governor's office. I got to sit with the governor and help create health policy, fly with him to different places. And it felt really big and important. And it was. That said, I will say that when you start your career in a policy environment, you learn a lot about systems and kind of theoretical things. When you transition, or as I transitioned into the business realm, that's where I really saw the policy interact with everyday life. And, you get a whole different perspective.
So you did make the shift, obviously, from state over into private sector roles. And what kind of roles did you hold before founding Authenticx?
Mostly operational roles, leadership roles within the health insurance or life sciences industries. So I worked with Medicare and Medicaid contracted businesses. So think of insurance companies that have contracted with state and federal government to administer health benefits. I worked with private health insurance companies for people who are insured through their employer. And then I also worked with pharmaceutical manufacturers and how they serve patient populations. And again, my roles were always leading the teams of people at the companies who interfaced with patients and providers every day, usually through a call center. And so I started to really appreciate all the data we were collecting, recording. We all have called customer service and heard that phrase.
Yeah.
This is being recorded for quality and monitoring purposes. Well, those were my teams. They were the ones taking those massive amount of calls every year. And that's where I started to see just how valuable the content of those conversations was. And that's kind of that was my the fertile ground from which I started to conceive of the idea of Authenticx.
Yeah, nice. Whenever I do call customer service, usually they're trying to get me not to speak to anybody these days, but they because they can't get any staff in the call centers. But I say it'll be recorded or monitored. And I think, what the heck does that mean? Someone standing over the shoulder, but it's a lot more than that, and it really, there really is something to it. So just with that in mind, then, you mentioned you were seeing this data that was being collected. So were there particular insights that led you to go beyond saying, hey, that's interesting, we can use it in our work, to actually say there may be a whole new company here?
Yes. Well, so working in operations, and being in a senior level role, what I started to realize is that my colleagues in marketing and sales in the C-suite tended to think of the operational call center as the cost center of the business, the part of the business where there's just transactions, right? And that was the impression. And what I could see is that these conversations were filled with unsolicited feedback from our customers telling us things like, things that they loved, things that they hated, what the competition is doing, what the website experience is. And no one of my colleagues were really thinking of the call center as a channel to receive those types of insights. In fact, they were spending millions of dollars on surveys to solicit from customers, the 10% of the population that actually filled a survey. And I just saw, wow, this is a big disconnect, you guys. Like, there's an opportunity for the operations teams to actually be the insights center for the entire enterprise. And I really wanted to kind of disrupt that thinking that the operational data set is just a bunch of transactions that don't have value for the rest of the business. And so that's the thing I wanted to prove with Authenticx.
Yeah. It's very interesting what you say about these surveys. So as a recipient of surveys, which I'm not alone, I think if there's a person who hasn't received a survey, please identify yourself. But you get a survey, and usually if you have something real to say about it, it's in the context of a broader set of interactions. And how can I don't remember, like, which call am I supposed to be talking about specifically, and what's happened since then, and what was going on. Whereas if you're actually just the interaction itself, I mean, that's the experience we're talking about. So you might as well, if it's being monitored, monitor it and do something with the information. So that's very interesting.
Yeah,
So,
like to your point, it's a survey is retrospective, right?
Yeah.
So the customer has to think back. They're also being asked the question that the company wants you to answer.
Yeah.
You're probably sick of being surveyed, so you're either going to respond if you're super delighted or super angry, right? So there's all kinds of reasons why it's a skewed data set.
Yeah.
And the reality is, and what we know from doing this work, is that customers are freely sharing their thoughts with this call center agent. The call center agent's job is not to take in all of these insights, because they're trying to satisfy the original problem, reason they called, and move on to the next one. But all that other goodness seems to get lost and just stored and ignored.
So I understand kind of the background of the company, why you're doing what you're doing, but what does the company do specifically, and how do you actually make it happen?
Yes, so we listen to the mass amounts of conversations that happen in and out of healthcare companies every day. So the types of companies we serve are pharmaceutical manufacturers, health insurance companies, and health provider systems. So think of hospitals and physician practices. And the types of calls you might think about scheduling, billing, claims questions, customer service. Those are the types of call lines we're listening to. What happens is data, those recorded conversations, flow into our cloud-based platform. We have passed all HIPAA and security guidelines to be able to do that. And what we're doing is using machine learning models to listen for key themes and emotion connected to those themes, so we know where to pinpoint or where to hone our focus with more human analysis. So if you think about a typical client of ours, they may take 100,000 calls a month. And so that's too much for a team of people to listen to them. And so we use AI or machine learning to listen to all 100,000 of them and to find the things that seem to indicate friction or customer negative sentiment. And then our product, our platform, teases out those respective conversations that our clients really want to hone in on and attune their ears to. And then we curate a list of interactions and insights from those interactions that help leaders have a much more in-depth understanding of some of the problems that they can start to solve as an organization.
Now, I'm sure that much of the work is kind of the textual analysis. I had read an article some time ago about some companies that were listening for the tone of a conversation and to hear the stress in people's voices. Does that factor in now, or might it in the future?
No, it does now. So we are listening both to the content of the words. So we transcribe audio files and look at the words being used and certainly glean insights from those. We're also using visual AI to study the sound waves, and that can give us an additional set of clues about the tone. So it's really the combination of the tone along with the word use that we're able to identify specific emotions.
So you have on your website some examples of the sort of insights that you generate. Can you give us an example of what an insight might be that would be generated and what kind of impact it could have? Because I could see people saying, yeah, it's interesting, and well, I know my customers are unhappy because I raised the price, or they can't get in to see the doctor, or they have COVID, or whatever. But what would be something that you could use this system for, as opposed to the things that people would sort of have in mind already?
Sure. So we have developed a specific algorithm we call the Eddy effect. The Eddy effect is our word for this phenomenon where patients or customers feel like they're stuck in their journey, in their experience with a healthcare company. I'm sure we've all been stuck in an eddy before.
Yeah.
That feeling of, hey, I got billed 3 times and I don't understand my bill. Or, hey, I've called and they promised they'd call me back and they never have. It's when you're trying to solve your own problem and the company keeps messing up.
Yeah.
That problem, which we call the Eddy effect, happens in mass quantities within the healthcare system. We typically see that 30% of all interactions are people who are expressing this feeling of being stuck and working really hard just to try to navigate their own care or their own billing experience, etc. And the reason that's so important for healthcare leaders to pay attention to is we can actually quantify how much it's happening. We can characterize the root cause of why it's happening. Is it a claims issue? It is a billing issue.
Yeah.
And then we can tie that prevalence rate to wasted dollars spent on the part of the company, all the hours of time they've spent trying to solve those problems, which by definition were preventable. And we're also able to tie the Eddy effect to patient sentiment and even patient attrition, meaning patients or customers who are just going to leave that company altogether because it's just been too hard to do business with. And so when you start to help leaders understand the financial impact of their poor customer experience, that's when it really means something and makes a big difference.
So what kind of customers do you have? Are they payers, providers, pharma companies? Who do you see as being interested? Who are you really aimed at?
Yeah, all of those that you just named are clients of ours, and we typically are working with either the customer experience team, which often falls underneath the marketing umbrella, the folks who are responsible for designing their customer journey and attracting new customers, retaining existing customers. The other party that we're often contracting with, doing business with, is the operational leaders, the folks who are responsible for carrying out those individual interactions and managing the workforce that's responsible for handling all of those interactions.
Sounds good. Well, I can imagine a few places where it would be necessary, and I wonder how many times I've been monitored with trying to solve my own problems or trying to stop myself from throttling somebody on the other end of the line.
It's very frustrating.
Yeah. I had one of those sort of eddies. I think it was more like a black hole, where it was a certain well-known hospital was trying to charge me $75,000 for something that I should have owed nothing for. And then I could see where it was going, actually. In that they were ready to, settle it or something, and I could see they were going to want to charge me $25,000 when I owe nothing. But luckily, I know the CEO of the hospital and of the payer. So even though I'd rather talk to them about selling them consulting work, I had to bring them in. So I don't know if that got picked up or not, but that did settle the problem. That's completely insane that had to happen.
I'm sorry that happened to you. You are not alone.
No, I know. So, I want to ask you now about the pandemic. And the reason is that, it's something that if you had a baseline, like you and I have been working in these fields for a long period of time, and then all of a sudden there was sort of a disconnect. And to try to understand consumer behavior, how organizations were reacting, and so on, I think a lot of people lost their moorings a lot of organizations in terms of what's the baseline supposed to be? Am I doing well? Am I doing badly? Can I even expect, should I just suspend measurement and analysis during this time frame because it's an emergency? What do you see in terms of the pandemic, and maybe, how that's changed over the past couple of years, how it's affected what you're doing?
Yes. When the pandemic hit, our clients suddenly transitioned from kind of using our software for kind of your basic customer experience analysis on quality and customer friction. And suddenly they were really focused on their own team. So how are my call center representatives doing? Where do they need support? Suddenly, most of them transitioned overnight from an office-based setting to a home-based setting and continue to have to do their work while managing their own home life, and kids home all of a sudden and that kind of thing. And then on the customer side of the conversations, our clients were really wanting to understand how do they maintain their customers' usage of their product or service? How do they support them in a whole new way? And how do we keep business going, right? And we learned a lot, depending on the sector. For example, for our hospital system clients whose billing system interactions we were listening to, we heard a lot of desperation from patients, consumers who had suddenly lost their job, who needed different types of payment policies, who needed the healthcare system to really transform how they were managing revenue cycle with their clients. On the flip side, with our pharmaceutical manufacturing clients, those patients who were calling those lines were really curious about how COVID was impacting their own immunity towards COVID. They were also curious if they got COVID, if they could continue to take their medication. There were all kinds of kind of therapeutic questions.
Yeah.
And so the listening really turned from kind of standard baseline to immediate, acute, constantly evolving how they were responding to the pandemic because of all the insights that were coming from these inbound conversations.
So much of the challenge in healthcare has to do with the lack of coordination and the lack of a healthcare system. So I think people may be struggling in this eddy, and part of it is that there is nobody usually to manage someone's navigation through the healthcare system. So people have to do it themselves. And a lot of the big frictions occur when you've got an individual patient, let's say, and they're trying to deal with multiple provider organizations or providers and payers, or trying to get payers to coordinate benefits, which was part of the issue in my case that I just referred to. Is there anything that you can do about that from I don't know if anytime you're on both sides of it, you're talking to the one health plan here, one health plan there, you're also involved with a provider. Is there any kind of a role that you've got overall to link these things together?
Yes, it's actually kind of our bigger vision is how do we actually improve the healthcare system as a whole, and especially in the United States. Because of who we serve, we serve the three core pillars, right? Pharmacy, payers, and providers. And we kind of talk about at Authenticx the big eddy being, if you aggregate all the customer interactions together, you can kind of see this big swirling motion of people being stuck just coordinating and navigating between those three pillars of their healthcare experience. And so we do a lot of conversing with the leaders of the organizations we serve to really understand how their industry is impacting the other, and how together they are creating complexity that is unsustainable for the healthcare consumer. The other thing we do is I just sat in on a session this morning about customer journeys. Oftentimes, especially the elderly population, it's not just the patient that's navigating the healthcare experience. It's also maybe their adult child or adult children and their spouse. And so there's entire family units. And we've seen in this journey work that I was working on today, there were maybe 350 calls across a cohort of 12. patients
Yeah.
and their family members in a given set of time, like something like less than 12 months. And so each of these units were having their own disparate conversations with, brothers talking to payer and spouses talking to the pharma manufacturer, and the patient himself is talking to, the provider's office. And it's just this giant, complex systemic problem. And if we could somehow shine a light on the complexity and move leaders to simplifying or even working together a little bit more effectively or collaboratively, we could reduce a lot of our administrative burden that we're putting on ourselves.
Great. Well, we'll do a longer podcast once that's all been checked off. It's nice that you've been able to characterize the problem in that way, and I think is very insightful. And that what you provide is actually something that goes beyond the typical ways of trying to diagnose it and do something about it, to go back to your comment about surveys before focus groups, that kind of thing. So how have you been building your own team during this time, and how has the company been funded?
Yes, so we, for the very first time in our history, just in June, opened up our first real office, because we launched and started our company just before the pandemic. And, when the pandemic hit, we maybe had 12 people, maybe 13.
Yeah.
And today we have 75. So we've grown from 13 to 75 entirely virtually. And that has been a real challenge, and something that I never wanted or chose to build my company in, but we've done really well. Thankfully, we have received financial support from investors. We've been through a Series A round of venture capital funding, and we'll probably be going through a Series B at the end of this year. And through that funding, we've been able to really scale and grow our team and continue to evolve and grow our client base, even despite all the obstacles of pandemic.
Sounds good. So you've gotten every experience as a CEO except like negotiating an office lease and that kind of
That's right.
thing. So, but anyway, the landlords are a little more forgiving right now than they were probably in 2019.
Yes, they are.
So final question just is about reading and really turning away from business, unless you want to talk about a business-oriented book. Have you read any good books lately? Anything that you would recommend, or anything that you recommend people avoid?
Avoid, that's funny. Gosh, so many good books. I have a book that I really love. I'm looking for it. I see it on my desk. It's called A Return to Love. And I know that sounds very fluffy maybe on its core, but it's really about the journey within your own self, and how that is truly the work that needs to be done in order for us to be free of maybe the burdens that we have picked up over the years. And it's about kind of that journey to your own authentic self. I believe a lot in authenticity and the power of it. That's why I named my company Authenticx. And so A Return to Love is a book that really resonates with me, and the journey of becoming your authentic self. I know you mentioned, David, that your listeners, many of them are maybe starting out in their career. And one of the things that I look back on my younger self and see, and wish I maybe would have known at that time, was I was so busy trying to compete that I was looking around me in the companies I was working, and I was trying to pick up the behaviors that seem to win success. Success being that next promotion or that next title or that next opportunity. And I had gotten to a phase in my life after I had turned 40 where I realized that all of those kind of attempts to compete started to turn me into someone that wasn't really who I authentically was anymore. And so the second phase of life for me is all about unlearning and becoming who I really am.
Great. Well, that's a great recommendation. Well, Amy Brown, founder and CEO of Authenticx, I want to say thank you very much for joining me on the HealthBiz podcast today and sharing the story of you and of Authenticx.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to the HealthBiz podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.